There are days when we need unstoppable energy. A lifeline to face down challenges so that we can soar. In those critical moments, we dig deep, and life's emergencies require unstoppable power. Unstoppable dedication to safety and high performance. It's in these moments that we are unstoppable together. Concord, the heart of your aircraft.
Climbs off all by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
Dick Rutan, U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, retired, 20 years active duty, soloed at 16, 325 missions in Vietnam. He is a founding member of the Misties, flying the F-100 as a forward air controller. He was shot down and rescued, highly decorated with 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses, Silver Star, 16 Air Medals, and the Purple Heart. He and Jeana Yeager set the world record flying brother Burt Rutan-designed Voyager non-stop, unrefueled, around the world. 3 days and nights in a flying phone booth. Dick holds many other civilian speed and distance records.
84. Oh, he's got 3 knots and he's got 4,000 feet to go.
87.
Still touching. And the wings come. She's gonna go. She's gonna go. Holy cow! Look at that. Come on, Dick. Get it up. Woo-hoo! God, I thought it wasn't gonna do it, Mike. I don't believe it.
So we're here to build excitement about reading Dick's book. It's really a wonderful book about his career. Hi, how are you?
Pretty good, David.
Good.
Good to see you.
Good to see
Hey,
you.
look at all these smiling people here.
Yeah.
I don't see any umbrellas.
No.
They're very courage.
Don't say it. Don't say it. But we're here today to talk about Voyager, because last year we talked about Sandy's and all of that. But this year we want to talk about Voyager. Dick, what was the goal of Voyager when you and Burt first thought about it? What was the goal?
The primary goal, and it turned out to be the major motivation that kind of sustained us for 5.5 years, is to be a milestone and be first to fly unrefueled around the world, non-stop, non-refueled. And we kind of looked at that as obviously a major milestone, but maybe the last one, arguably an atmospheric flight. And so that's that motivation. And all the trials and tribulations that we had during the 5.5-year odyssey to do this, to maintain the motivation, all I had to do was I'd go out in the Mojave Airport on the ramp and sit with my back up against the hangar, all by myself. And I close my eyes and put my head back a little bit, and I try to imagine what it would feel like to land at Edwards Air Force Base, having accomplished aviation's last first. And then I let that settle a little bit and let that permeate into my psyche. And I decided that would feel pretty darn good. And so whatever the problems were, I could just get up and just hammer at it again.
So how accurate is it, the thought that you and Burt were sitting in a coffee shop or restaurant and he sketched it out on a napkin? Is that accurate?
No, that's accurate. In fact, most great airplanes start either in a restaurant or in a bar with a drawing on a napkin. That's kind of traditional. But Burt had been thinking about this, and he realized that we now have available the material that's going to make a transglobal flight unrefueled possible. That's carbon fiber. And he says that with carbon fiber, it is now possible for the first time to design, build an airplane capable of 29,000 statute miles unrefueled range.
Wow. How much did it go from the napkin to the realization of what he had to do in terms of design to make that happen, even though he understood carbon fiber could potentially make it happen?
Well, up until it's a good question. Up until the time we met in the restaurant, he never put pen to paper or even worked out any kind of numbers and, all the formulas those genius designers used to do airplanes. He never did any of that. And this was kind of a concept that he had in his mind. And thank goodness the Voyager ended up to be looking nothing like what he drew on the napkin that day.
Oh, really? So you said a couple of times 5.5 years. From napkin to takeoff in December of '86, it was 5.5 years?
It was, right at 5.5 years. And Burt thought it would take, in fact, he said, well, Dick, why don't you do this Voyager thing? And it's going to take maybe 18 months, and then you can go on with something more useful in your life. Holy bananas.
So, but what besides the design, what were the biggest challenges for you and Jeana in the whole process to get to where you could actually fly the airplane?
Well, initially, everybody's concerned about the performance and the structures and the handling qualities and any concern that you have on another airplane. And we knew this airplane had to be extremely compromised as far as systems reliability, handling qualities, stability and control, structural margins. Where most airplanes are designed, that most of them that we fly, they are designed for an ultimate yield. That's when you pull it enough, and the wings will break off between 5 and 6 Gs. The Voyager, when we took off, for the first 3 days, we had a structural limit, G-wise, of 1.3 Gs. And that meant just a very little tiny turbulence of any kind would actually break the wings off.
So in December, when you took off, what was the date? December?
It was December 14th.
14th. So what were the last surprises when you got in the plane that day, if there were any last surprises?
Well, another thing that we didn't realize, human factors. How difficult this was going to be physically and also mentally. And if we hadn't have learned some of the things the hard way, unfortunately, the flight of the Voyager would have failed due to human factors. And to a fighter pilot, to fail in front of the whole world and say, hey, I quit, I'm tired. I'd rather cut off both legs with a dull paring knife than do that. But there were some things that were so challenging, they were really beyond our control.
Including?
Well, one is fatigue, obviously, and some other things that we kind of learned the hard way. When we brought the first Very Easy prototype to Oshkosh in 1974, I set a world distance record between here and Menominee, Wisconsin. And we flew most of the day and set a light category record. But then we flew some other distance records. In fact, those records that we set in the late 70s, when I first got to Mojave from the Air Force, they still stand today. And one of them was a non-stop, non-refuel flight, and it was from Anchorage, Alaska. Just think about this. Anchorage, Alaska, this is non-stop, non-refueled, all the way down across, we went from Alaska to Canada to North Dakota to Atlanta, Georgia, to Cape Canaveral, Florida, out over the ocean, and all the way down the last island in the British West Indies chain, which was Grand Turk. And that flight took right at 30 hours, non-stop, non-refuel. But the first one we set, it was a close course distance record, and it was between Mojave, there in the high desert where we lived, up north, up to by the Sierra Nevada, Mount Whitney, and so forth, up to Bishop. And we did that for 33 and a half hours. And that was exactly to the minute that Lindbergh's flight was from New York to Paris. And it was no help. It was all hand flown. And
how did that affect you
Well-
as an experience, that kind of time?
well, we really learned a lot about that. Because, here the guy that got in that airplane that morning, he was one of these arrogant fighter pilots. Hell, I could do anything. I never thought about any human factors or that Dick Rutan would be any way challenged to do that. Holy bananas, what I surprised.
Right.
Because that night before takeoff, we had some maintenance on it. And Burt really didn't want to, he wasn't interested in records, but I kind of was. And I took his old prototype, and we had some magneto change. And basically, I was working up through midnight to fix this thing. And then we were supposed to get up an hour before dawn so we could weigh the airplane and have it certified and fuel it and get in and do all those certification things. And so I really didn't hardly sleep at all. I was kind of nervous about the big flight coming up, and woke up maybe an hour earlier than I should have. But basically, I was up all day, and only a couple of hours before I took off. We checked in, and the similarities between Lindbergh was incredible, because he didn't sleep before either. And we showed up to take off just right at dawn, and fueled the airplane and took off and started shuttling back and forth. I guess the daytime wasn't too bad, but when the sun went down, then the fatigue really hit me bad. I started to hallucinate, started to see gremlins talking to me, sitting on my canard, telling me they're going to kill me. But another thing we learned about was sensory deprivation. When you're really busy, like if you're busy doing something that's exciting, and if you're involved in a very pleasurable experience, let's say, time goes by just like that, damn it. But then if it's boring and something you don't like, time progresses agonizingly. Like if a truck rolls up on your legs and you're in excruciating pain, a minute seems to be a lot longer than it used to be. So we learned about how to handle fatigue based on how you process time.
All right, to what extent did this translate over to Voyager from 33 hours to 3 days and nights?
Well, the thing that we learned about that, and we learned the hard way, when I landed after that, I was talking to demons, and I was talking to war, and trying to stay awake, and smelling salts. And
When you were in the airplane?
Yeah, when in the airplane during the flight. And I couldn't believe it. This guy come and sat on my canard, a little black guy. I mean, not a Negro guy, but he was a black elf with the meanest looking face you can remember. And if my canopy hadn't have been there, I could have reached out and grabbed him by the neck. And he was telling me, "You're already dead, Dick. You've already dead." And he described in detail the crash. And he says, now, everybody that dies on planet Earth, this is perfectly normal. That they all feel this way. It's your home, you're reluctant to go. You don't know you don't know where he wants to take you, and you're uneasy about that. He says, it's okay, just relax, go to sleep and come with me. And I tell you what, I had to dig awful deep not to go with him that night.
So how many hours were you flying before you gave up the seat to Jeana, who didn't have nearly your flying experience?
No, Jeana did not have, unfortunately, that experience. And that was a big problem. There was training issues. Everybody knew that Jeana had to do a lot of training. I mean, to be even a reasonable co-pilot for this thing. Ideally, Dave, if you and I were going to fly this mission, of
course, you and I would not have fit in that cockpit together.
That's a metaphor, okay. But just to make the point, I have a lot of confidence in your experience. And I know when you're sitting up there driving the airplane that you can handle whatever comes up equally as well as I can. Now, you have a confidence and then you can lay down and you can actually go to sleep. But you have to, and then we'd swap positions, and then the other pilot could sleep. But the problem with Jeana, she couldn't do any of that stuff. So to answer your question in a minute, when I put her in the seat, and I realized that even if the autopilot kicked off, we're going to lose the airplane. So now that's a high level of anxiety when you're laying back there, and you're a good maybe at least 30, 35 seconds from the controls, and the airplane will come apart in about 15 seconds when it starts uncontrollable pitching. That anxiety level, it really makes it, you got to be really tired to go to sleep. But to answer your question specifically, And we did not know how we were going to handle any of that on the takeoff. In fact, I was talking to Burt and the ground crew, and they says, hey, you just can't do that. There will be a failure for the because of crew fatigue. And they were probably right, I guess. But in any case, we took off. And now for 5.5 years I've been working on. I mean, this is the opportunity to hang my airplane in a nice museum and give talks and have the honor of meeting David, or y'all, really. So we took off, and I thought, well, we'll just handle it the best we can. But to answer your question, I spent the first day, the first night, the second day, the second night, the third day, and the third night, and the fourth day. And I was going to go into the fourth night and said, I can't do the 4 nights.
So you flew that all?
Yep. I sat in the seat for, 3 nights. But the evening of the fourth day, I was looking at the fourth night, and I said, I don't care how arrogant you are and how great you think you are. There is no fine way you're going to be able to go 4 nights in a row. It just can't be done.
And where were you in the flight? You flew to the west. How far had you gotten at that point?
Okay, we'd gone through Hawaii, and we were just going feet dry into the Philippines. But and I had a protocol. I would never put her in the seat at night, because if she could see outside, maybe she could fly it visually, hopefully. But at night, I just thought there was really no way that she could do that. And so, but all day long, we're fighting weather and fine-tuning it and talking to people and I mean, really busy. But the neat part of the workload on the Voyager was just exactly right. Because if the workload was easy and there was nothing to do, I'd become bored. Remember how you pass the time? And so if you're busy, you're doing something interesting, and you're fine-tuning this thing and looking out for the weather and the winds and communicating with mission control, it's a perfect combination of being busy to control. The biggest problem we had is the perception of the passage of time and how you control that. Like this closed course distance record when I had the hallucinations and stuff and no sleep the day before. The second one, we went to Alaska, and we're going to fly to the British West Indies nonstop. Only that one, I was smart that time because I got a whole bunch of sleep, and I knew I was going to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I changed the circadian rhythm, and I went to bed at 6 o'clock every night for about a week up there. They all went out to dinner, and they're going to movies, and I have to go home and go to sleep because I was bound and determined I was going to get a full night's sleep. And then on that flight, it was to control the passage of time. And every time I would get bored and we feel that the time is slowing down a little bit, we had a little tape recorder, and I'd record some really melodramas. Now, us graybeards, we can remember the thing about the little melodramas on the CBS radio mystery hour, The Shadow Knows. And if you get bored a little bit, you just pop in one of those things, and you're listening to it. You're involved in following the little melodrama, and before you even know it, 20 minutes have gone by, and it's not fatiguing. Stuff like that. And we flew all day and all night and landed just before dark at Grand Turk, and the governor came out to meet us. He was really a nice guy, and I crawled out of the airplane, and I felt great. I just felt like I'd had a full night's sleep. I was rested, happy, went out to dinner with the governor, and went to bed normally. So we knew something. We learned something really vital.
Well, when you further on, whoops, here comes an airplane. Mosquito,
beautiful.
that's coming, and these mosquitoes coming next. At what point did you finally get to sleep and get some real sleep, and for how long?
Right. What we did up until then, I'm not saying I stayed awake for 3 darn nights. I was sitting in the seat, and I would take a cat nap. 5 minutes. I said, Jeana, give me 5 minutes of sleep. So she'd stop the watch, and her job was to wake me up in 5 minutes. And that helped a lot more than I thought it was going to do. I said, well, I'm reasonably refreshed. It helped. I don't feel, even after 5 minutes of sleep, I felt a lot better than I did before I went to sleep, sitting in the seat. But the funniest thing happened is when you go to sleep, you're sitting there flying, and then you want to close your eyes, and when you close your eyes, your head falls over. And when you do that, the inner circular canals will feed information into the brain. And every time I would close my eyes, the Voyager would pitch up like that and start to do a half roll. And I'd open my eyes, nope, we're straight and level. What the hell is going on? And so then you do that 3 or 4 more times, and you know the airplane is pitching up and rolling like that. And then you just fight your way through it. No, I'm not going to wake up. I got to sleep. And then every time I'd move my head, the headset would give a different vibration, and it would sound like a main bearing is going, oop, what's that noise? You know. And so you go through all those iterations before you can actually go to sleep. But after about the 3rd day, I could take a Slortnet cat nap in the seat, and she would wake me up. And when I'd wake up, I had absolutely no idea where I was. I looked around, where the heck am I? You know, what are all these gauges up there? My hand? What does all this mean? And I literally, mentally had to go all the way back to Edwards Air Force Base and remember that I took off and I flew, and now we're in Hawaii and Guam, and then catch up, and okay, now I can do it. But then we were going to do a test, and I says, can I wake up quick enough to be useful consciousness, I guess the term, to useful consciousness. If I'm asleep and the autopilot kicks off and the airplane starts porpoising, I got 15 seconds to fix it. 15 seconds is when it comes apart. Can I wake up in 15 seconds to be useful conscious? And the horror was, as I got into this thing, I'd wake up and it took about 30 to 40 seconds to get there. So now what are you going to do? So anyway, I got out of the seat for the first time going into the Philippines, and there was still bad weather. It wasn't really good weather, but I thought, I can't do another night. And so I crawled out of the seat and let Jeana fly, or sit and watch the autopilot. And I think I laid out for the first formal sleep, and it was about an hour and a half. And then we had a mechanical failure we had to fix. So it seems like every time I got down in the back, something really bad happened.
But when you finally woke up and got back in the seat, were you rested enough to keep it together and not have the dashboard bulge and all of that stuff?
Well, the dashboard bulge was high altitude due to hypemic hypoxia. And that was hypoxic altitude, and that was a really bad thing. But then, even an hour and a half, all of a sudden, she woke me up and the attitude indicator had failed. I looked at the attitude indicator and it was wings level. Then I looked out the 2 windows and we're banked. And I know we were screwed then. But the attitude indicator was a critical part of the autopilot. And fortunately, because I had doubts about an electric gyros, they'd have high failure rates. And we did bring it back up, thank goodness, or else the mission would have ended there in the Philippines. Anyway, we changed that out. And then when I turned the radio on to listen, the Philippine controllers were apoplectic with anger.
What were they upset about?
Well, I turned it over to Jeana. I said, here's air traffic control. Talk to them, tell them what they want, where we're going, and so forth. Do pilot things on the radio. She wouldn't talk to anybody. She never talked to anybody. And when I finally woke up and got on the radio again, boy, they were upset, and rightfully so. But I knew that if they weren't going to shoot me down, I would be out of Philippine airspace in 3 or 4 hours. And if they were upset, they can send me a postcard to Mojave.
What happened when you got over the mountains of Africa?
The Africa crossing. We were outside of our weather window. We had missed it because of a propeller failure. And the weather department guys, they told me that we were too late and we missed the favorable weather window to go around the world. And so I'm so tired and frustrated and no money and trying to make sure the volunteers show up, and it was just really getting to me. And so I says, Lynn, look, here's what it is. I said, you go back in your weather department and you find me a way around the world. Now, the airplane's not ready yet, maybe a handful of days, but when it's ready, I'm going to open the door, I'm going to walk outside and look up. If it's raining, we'll wait till it stops raining. And as soon as it stops raining, we're going to take it over to Edwards Air Force Base, and we're going to fly around the world. And so he went back and came back and said, yeah, Dick, I found another way. Except I can't get you across Central Africa. And so I got a world map out, big world map, California, Europe, all the way to Asia, big map. And I noticed that the Africa part of this thing, percentage-wise, I could hold it on my fingers. Central Africa is about that far, see? Big, long. I looked at that and I says, hell, we'll worry about that when we get there. He was exactly right. Because Central Africa, the jungles, the hot, moist jungles of Central Africa, there's only one other place on planet Earth where the storms are more vicious, and that's the Amazon basin. And any of you that have flown down there and knows that you talk about rain showers, wow, they know about that a lot. And it's the same thing. In fact, in Central Africa, the equatorial trade winds that we were running around the world towards the west with tailwinds, when those huge thunderstorms get going, the equatorial trade winds blow those things out over the Atlantic, and they turn into hurricanes. And those same trade winds that we're flying would carry turn into big hurricanes or typhoons, bad weather, right? And they ravage our southeastern coast of America. But those were right there where those Hummers form. And at that time, we started climbing and climbing and climbing. And here's a non-pressurized airplane. It started the front engine again, to hell with range. And I'm seeing all these thunderstorms going all over. And the agony of the airplane that goes so bloody slow. Oh, God.
What airspeed most of the trip?
Not too technical, but the optimum speed to fly, L/D, max is what they call it. But when it's heavy, that thing is shifted to the right, and you got to go faster to fly that. Every pound that you burn fuel off, that thing gets slower and slower and slower and slower. So about halfway around the world, we'd be looking at maybe 42 knots indicated.
42 knots?
42 knots indicated. Now, if you got halfway around the world and you got birds going by laughing, that's it. The agony of that was horrible. And the only way to deal with that, I kept thinking, God, look at this speed. I look up there, 2 thunderstorms. And then I start heading between them, trying to climb between them. And before I get there, they start joining hands. So then I got to turn around and fly back and fly another one. There was a good part of the time on Africa that W was not anywhere near the top of the compass. And in and out of those things and higher and higher. And we didn't turn our oxygen up high enough. And both of us became severely hypoxic. For another reason, we had checked our oxygen requirements for high altitude, but we were rested. We were feeling fine. Did it in Mojave. Made a little chart instead of taking an SPO gauge that tells what your blood oxygen saturation is. So I had this little chart. Okay, that was going to save us 1.5 pounds because I made a paper chart. Didn't need this little thing in my finger. We made a chart. If you're 18,000 feet, you look at the chart. Jeana needs 3.2 liters per minute, and Dick needs twice that, I guess. But she could go to 19,000 feet before she even needed oxygen. And so anyway, I depended on that, but we didn't know that the fact that if you're tired, that the ability for the blood to transfer the oxygen to the lungs, they call it hypemic hypoxia. And boy, were we in deep oxygen deficit. And the thing is that I needed that oxygen, and I didn't know what the next week was going to handle. More high altitude, more icing that we had to deal with.
Or the next 5 minutes?
Or the next 5 minutes, yeah. But anyway, I stayed religiously on that chart, and it was really a bad thing to do. And it's one of those demand oxygen controllers from the medical industry. You breathe in, turn the light on. So I put 2 little LEDs up on the instrument panel. You talk about a Pavlovian response. It's really cool. You breathe in, turn the light on. Breathe in, turn the light on. How many of you use the demand oxygen controller They're really a cool thing. They squirt oxygen in your nose only when you're breathing in, not out. And so you can extend the use of the oxygen a lot. So I breathe in, turn the light on. And if you do that for a couple, 3 hours, it's Pavlovian response. You can be down here doing something else, and you breathe in, and peripherally you see that damn light going to come on. And I could do the same for Jeana, too. I would monitor her, whether she was getting oxygen.
How did you get over the mountains?
You know, I don't know. I do not know how we got over it, and I'll tell you why I don't know. We were going higher and higher, and we were going through this, besides these vicious storms all around. We'd try to go into an area, and then we'd turn around, and your heart would leap, and you say, my way out. You've all been in that. The people that fly, you turn around, the weather's worse behind you than it is ahead of you, and your heart sinks, and you got that really horrible feeling. And it's bad enough, but this airplane, you just touch the edge of one of those thunderheads, and the airplane will disintegrate. The mission will end in the jungles of Central Africa, and nobody will ever have a clue about what happened, even if they ever find you. And so, more than once, and I was trying to climb higher and higher and higher as I could get. And then we started to hallucinate. Jeana had passed out. She was no longer conscious. Her skin was cold and clammy. And I would shake her. I could feel her skin was cold. And then all of a sudden she would explode into consciousness and didn't know where she was. And her eyes would dart back and forth. There's a scientific word for that, when your eyes dart back and forth. And then pretty soon, you know, I'm in bad shape too. And all of a sudden the instrument panel started blowing out like a big beach ball. And so I'm holding it, see, with one hand. And I'm saying, Jeana, help me. Look at this thing. It's blowing out. Well, when you start to hallucinate that bad, you know you're in bad trouble for hypoxia. But the problem with hypoxia, it is an insidious onset. And it's kind of a euphoric effect. It's kind of like a cheap drunk. So if you have an onset that's kind of sneaky and it's kind of pleasurable, well, you can set yourself up in some pretty bad time. But anyway, to answer your question, the next thing that I can remember in doing this book, I was trying for the life of me to find out how we got out of these horrible situations to 6,000 feet with no clouds, perfectly smooth, and cruising out over Western Africa. And I have no conscience of that at all, absolutely none, of how we got there.
Well, you finally did get there, and you got back across the Atlantic, back to Edwards, and you land, right?
Right.
What, 9 days?
3 minutes and 44 seconds.
44 seconds, right? Worth it?
Well, of course. It was worth it. For 5.5 years, I maintained the motivation. What would it feel like to have accomplished this mission? And because I thought that would feel pretty good, I used that as a motivational device. In fact, it was just barely capable of keeping us going for that 5.5 years. And then we landed at Edwards. Had to beat up the field a little bit too. But what are they going to do to me? I'm Dick Rutan, and we just flew around the world. Nobody's going to get mad at us. So we flew. All these people, tens of thousands of people, come out to see us. They just didn't want to see an airplane land.
The tower? What was your exchange with the tower when you came back in?
Well, before I could see the Edwards complex and that nice runway, even though Burt told me that there's all the people and the press was there and people were lined up way back into Lancaster, it didn't even permeate. The only thing I'm really cognizant of is that it's a restricted area. Now, I've gone in the restricted area 6 times at Edwards, but it was always on the invitation of a word called Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And I thought, there's nothing wrong with this airplane. But then this horrible thought is if they won't let us in the restricted area and they won't let us land at Edwards because they're busy and they don't want to mess around with some home-built airplane, then I got to do this whole thing over again. And so I was going to plead with the tower operator to please let us in, and he'd feel sorry for me. And I says, I'm 20 minutes south, and I know you're busy, and I don't want to interfere with any of your traffic. But if you just clear me in and let me land on a remote area of the dry lake, I'd really appreciate that. And he comes back and he says, Voyager 1, this is Edwards Tower. Sir. He's confused. He says, sir, we have canceled flying for today, and we're all here waiting for your return. And I was flabbergasted. They canceled flying? I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar military programs by Lockheed and Boeing and stuff. I went a little home built from some little out-of-the-way town in Mojave 20 miles away. Who would care? But then there was an undercast, and I couldn't see. And right at the edge of the restricted area, at 8,000 foot on top, all of a sudden the overcast ended. And I looked down, and I saw that hallowed ground where Chuck Yeager and Scott Crossfield chased the demons in the sky. To us, that is aviation's hallowed ground, the Muroc Edwards Complex. That's where all the big stuff was done. And I looked on the Western Dry Lake, and there was tens of thousands of people who crowded into the Western Dry Lake. And I thought, I could not believe it. They came out here for us, and I was flabbergasted. But we finally got down, and they wanted me to fly an extra 30 minutes so I could have an even 9 days. I thought that sounded better. Anyway, we did a bunch of low approaches and buzzed the crowd. And I wanted to let the crowd listen to those little engines that puttered its way slowly around the world. And another thing is a tribute of thanks. Because Burt and Jeana and I, we didn't do this. We had all kinds of experts that came and did this. It was a total team effort. And then when time is up, Jeana put the gear down, and we came down and landed on aviation's hallowed ground, taxied up to that news place. And before I landed, I looked at all its press agencies, all its press cameras all over the place, and I thought, Dick, you better not screw this up, because you'll never be able to buy all that film from them. We touched down and rolled up in front of the crowd. They stayed away so the inspector can come and remove the barographs and
the FAA guy.
The FAI guy.
FAI,
Federation Aeronautica International. They were going to homologate and certify that record. And boy, I wanted that done. I didn't want 8 chances on that thing. And then while they were doing that, when the engines were finally shut down, I closed my eyes and put my head back, and just for a handful of time, and I realized that it felt every bit as good as I'd always imagined it for 5.5 years.
Wow. How does it, yeah. Wow. What's it feel like to join the Wright brothers, Doolittle, Lindbergh, Yeager, to name just a few of the iconic, people of aviation?
One of them,
and realize that you're in that handful of names.
It's very humbling, and I'll tell you what happened. There's another person you want to add to that list, Lieutenant Lee Wade.
Why?
You know who Lieutenant Lee Wade? Anybody know? Raise your hand. You know who Lieutenant Lee Wade is. Lieutenant Lee Wade flew the first airplane, the Douglas World Cruisers, around the world in 1924. Wow. And when we enshrined the airplane in the National Air and Space Museum, in attendance was Lieutenant Lee Wade. And here's the guy that did it first, period, and the same guy that did it nonstop years and years later. And what an honor it was to him. But this thing about celebrity status, and to me, I guess I'm like nobody else. Oh man, I'm Dick Rutan. I flew around the world, and I'm this big celebrity, and people, whatever. And it started to go to my head, and the neatest thing happened. And I think that God put this person in the line that day to take care of Dick, hopefully. And he come up, and we're selling the beautiful poster for $10. And I was autographing them all morning, taking. And this individual come up, and he's a young guy, and he come up and he looked at me, and he looked at the poster, and he says, "Yeah, it's really a nice poster." He says, "How much is it?" And I told him, and he says, "Yeah," he thought about it, and he says, "Yeah, I think I'll buy one." And I'm standing there, you know what I'm saying? "Well, do you want it autographed?" And he looked at me, and he looked all around, and he said something. God love him. He looked all around, and he said, "Autographed by who?" Oh my God. That knocked the wind out of my sails, and hopefully it brought me down to humility again. And I never forget that, about what an honor it is to do that.
What's the title of your book?
When I'm writing the book, I realized that there had been, how many times there had been, when I was looking down a runway or looking out of a cockpit, or coming out of North Vietnam on fire, or the balloon ruptured and we had to bail out, or crashing at the North Pole, or some of the real wild combat missions that I'd been involved in, or flight tests. At the end of the runway doing some weird thing, or some weird airplane. And what I was thinking about at that time, I wonder what the next 5 minutes is going to be like. And I says, hey, that sounds like a name of a book. And so it's all based on kind of the life and times of the next 5 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dick Rutan.